is genre? Genre is a French word meaning type or kind. So essentially it means to categorise something. So when we talk about the film industry, it's categorising films or any form of entertainment into a certain category. So I've taken 3 categories here, which are very typical categories: horror, action and drama. Now, when we look at horror films, typical horror films would be The Shining, Silence of the Lambs. That's because they consist of your typical horror conventions. Maybe in The Shining, a case of a scary house, they're in an isolated location. It's tense music. Silence of the Lambs, it's this killer who's murdering and eating people, and it's tense. It consists of horror conventions. It consists of a horror narrative. James Bond, it consists of horror themes, action, chases, guns. That makes up the action genre. Drama, a BBC drama, Silent Witness, a fairly typical drama with lots of investigations. Discuss what different genres are and what are genres. We're going to look at what makes up a specific genre. So, an action genre, a horror genre and a comedy genre is what we're going to focus on here. So the first thing I want to discuss is iconography. Iconography is basically objects or symbolic things within a film which are iconic to that genre. So, typical iconography of an action genre will be guns, fast cars, chases. If we take action films like James Bond, American Sniper, Die Hard, these all consist of the same iconography. So from the iconography you can determine that those films are an action genre. Now, horror. Horror consists of different iconography, different iconic symbolic elements which make up that genre. A haunted house, ghosts. They are just typical symbolic elements which make up horror. They are iconic to the horror genre. Comedy. Generally, I'd say iconography that makes up a comedy genre is essentially things that don't work. Objects being put in places that aren't supposed to be there, which makes the characters confused. That's generally an iconography of a comedy genre. There's a lot more iconography I could go through in all of these, but there's some typical iconography which makes up those genres. So, iconography, iconic symbolic objects which make up that genre. Okay, next I'm going to look at character roles. Now, character roles that would make up an action genre, for example, we would have protagonist, which is, of course, the hero. The antagonist, which of course is the villain. The helper. This might be the helper of the protagonist, the hero, or the helper of the antagonist, the villain. They're typical character roles which would make up an action genre. Generally, in every single action film, you will always find a protagonist and an antagonist. It always happens. Character roles of a horror film. We always have a victim. We always have someone who's about to walk into a room and there's a ghost that's going to murder them. We always have that character role. An antagonist, again, we will always have a villain in a horror genre. It's just stereotypical of that genre. Comedy. Now, character roles in comedy genres, they're often juxtaposing characters, which means they're opposite characters. You might have someone who's really posh and outgoing, and you might have someone who's a poor person on a street or something. They're opposite characters, juxtaposing characters. Often they have awkward relationships because, of course, that's what makes it funny. It makes up that comedy genre. Now, when we watch a film like action, horror, comedy, we go to the cinema and we have expectations of the iconography, the character roles, the narrative structure, the visual styles and music. We have expectations. We go there thinking we're going to see these characters. We're going to have these kind of themes, okay? That's the expectations of a genre. Now, onto narrative structure. Narrative structure of an action film would be often quite chronological. So, we have the equilibrium, where everything is okay. Disruption of the equilibrium. The antagonist comes and tries to kill the villain. Then we have the climax, the big explosion where everything happens, everything blows up. Then we have the resolution, where the protagonist comes back and tries to save the day. So the narrative structure of an action film is normally chronological, quite linear. Whereas the narrative structure of a horror genre would actually be quite non-linear, because it consists of flashbacks going back and forth maybe from 20 years ago, that she has this flashback of her father coming in and it all changes. So it's often quite non-linear, so it's quite the opposite narrative structure to an action. The flashbacks, yeah, we always have flashbacks in horrors. It's something we see. There's very few horror films without a flashback or a memory. Again, we always have a climax in a horror film. The big moment when that tense music comes up and it's suppressing, it's that moment. Okay, on to comedy. So these generally don't have much of a narrative because comedies don't really focus on the story themselves. It's more the situations they're in. But generally, one scene triggers the next. So a funny situation, a funny circumstance would trigger the next funny circumstance. So again, it's quite chronological comedy. Visual styles and themes. Now, visual styles and themes are very typical to that genre. So action music would be very fast, mirroring a fast car chase. Again, they're fast cuts. So we have a cut of a car coming this way, and it's fast of a helicopter here. It's often cutting on the beat of the music. They're the visual styles and music. Horror, they would often have slow, tense music, building up that suspense tension. Maybe dark rooms, creaking doors. That would be the visual styles and music which make up a horror genre. Comedy, they generally actually consist of very little effects because the focus isn't on effects. So it might have funny music though to match a funny situation that's quite slapstick. So here we have all the things which make up genres. Okay, so following on from looking at what genre is, we have all these different kinds of genre like action, romance, thriller, sci-fi. Now, some films, what they do is they combine these genres together. When we combine these genres together, we get what we call a hybrid genre. That's a film that consists of more than one genre. They're combined genres. Examples of a hybrid genre would be, for example, James Bond. The reason this is because James Bond primarily consists of action. However, it also has thriller in it. It also has romance because, of course, James Bond always finds a girl. So it consists of more than one type of genre. Therefore, we could argue that James Bond is a hybrid genre. Again, Doctor Who, for example. Doctor Who is certainly a thriller, it certainly has a mystery genre to it, and it certainly has sci-fi, a science fiction element with all these things coming from the future, you know, aliens and all these ideas. So James Bond and Doctor Who, these two would certainly be hybrid genres. Finally, the last thing I want to look at is generic development. Now, essentially what this is, a guy called Thomas Schartz came up with this theory that every genre goes through this cycle. Now, the cycle starts with innovative. So this is the idea that a film comes along and it's original. There's never been a film like it. There's never been a genre quite like this. It brings original codes and conventions and iconography that no one's ever seen before. Then, this becomes so popular that it becomes classical. Loads of directors and producers start making films similar to this. Therefore, we get an expectation. Okay? That's classical. Most films on the market today are classical films. We go in there knowing what's going to happen. An innovative film would be the James Bond film of Dr. No 1962. Because in 1962, no one had ever seen anything like this, James Bond. And so it was in an innovative genre. It brought codes and conventions which had never been seen before. But then a classical James Bond film would be Spectre in 2015. We know exactly what's going to happen. We know how the narrative's going to be. We know what the iconography is going to be. We know exactly what's happening. That's a classical example of Thomas Schartz's theory. Then we come to parody. Now, he thought that after classical, other directors would actually start taking the mickey out of these genres. So people expect from a romance genre sort of love and everything, and then directors and people would make a film taking the mickey out of a romance genre. This would happen with all genres, action, romance, drama. That was known as a parody. Finally, we have deconstruction. This was generic elements of codes and conventions are challenged. In other words, the original iconography of action films, guns, cars, all that is challenged. So we have an action film with none of the original guns, cars, action. We have none of that. We have something different. That's essentially the end of a cycle. Then we come back to innovative. In my opinion, I think innovative and deconstruction are actually quite similar. So in my personal response, I think it ends at parody, okay? Because I think deconstruction is it's just sort of the same as innovative, but Thomas Sharpe thought differently. Finally, my favourite two genres are action and horror, because I think they consist of the most interesting codes and conventions, and most of my favourite films, like, I don't know, Silence of the Lambs, James Bond, fit into these categories. Also, these genres kind of interlink a bit. They're kind of similar in some ways. That's why I like them. Okay, thank you very much. That'll be it.